And to start off with, I think it's generally a good idea to get us some context as to where we are. So let's start with that, Samo. What is great founder theory that you basically built your thought leadership brand on? I know that's a horrible phrase to use, thought leader, but I don't have any other words at hand to describe that. What is great founder theory in a nutshell for people that are not so familiar with your work?
Great founder theory is a theory of history. It is a story, it is a hypothesis as to sort of what the engine of history is. What is the factor, something that matters counterfactually, right? Something that sort of explains the predominant outcomes. Most basically, great founder theory is the idea that human society is profoundly shaped by its institutions, and that these institutions in turn have their origin with either individuals or small, closely coordinated groups of founders. So whatever great institution you can think of, and whatever major social technology you might think typical for any civilization, say for medieval Europe, it might be the Catholic Church. For the modern world, it might be political institutions, economic institutions. So it might be the democracy, it might be, it might be bookkeeping that allows like corporate ledgers. It might even be something as interesting as central banking, depending on how much you've drunk the economist Kool-Aid. Whatever you pick, right? Whatever key organization you feel is predominant, that has a history. And I think so many of these institutions, when you look at them, go through these very discrete and sudden jumps in complexity that happen just much too quickly to be the result of like long-term cultural evolution. I think these sudden jumps in complexity are best thought of as someone building a machine, not made out of iron, not made out of iron and copper and wire and plastic, but one made out of people. These machines are built, they're sometimes copied, over time they can decay. And I'm really interested in sort of the architects, right, who don't necessarily know everything that their institution is going to do to society. They often have no idea that they might end up defining whole civilizations through their work, such as I think definitely Confucius did. To give a Chinese example or to give a European example, I think Charlemagne, but they do understand what they're doing, at least intuitively. They do understand that they are changing the way people coordinate, changing the way they learn, changing how they produce, and so on.
Now, I find this particularly interesting because I'm quite interested at the moment in the question of optimism and pessimism and how they do become quite self-fulfilling philosophies, which I think ties into the live versus dead player conversation we'll have in a minute. But I do find what you're saying really interesting, because what you're essentially saying is that individuals or small groups of people have an outsized impact on society. That is the individual or the small group that's very deliberate in what they do that actually sort of nudges the needle going forward. And that sort of a statement can be seen as both either very disempowering or very empowering, depending on whether you are an optimist or a pessimist. On the one hand, if you are less optimistic, that kind of says, well, most of us are kind of the non-playable characters in this drama, and there's only a few sort of key roles, and like most of us just passengers on spaceship Earth, and like that can be quite defeatist, I think, for some people looking at this. On the other hand, if you are more of an optimist, there's a very different story to be had there, and that is that individuals move the needle of history, which means that all the actions that all of us take are hugely powerful, and we can be that playable character if we so choose to be so. And when I say we, I'm talking at an individual level, but also at a societal level. So whether you're looking at a nation state or whether you're looking at an organization, you can kind of choose to be that player, but it does take, as the subtext in what you were saying, some sort of direction and some sort of vision as to what should happen next. And that reminded me of something that I read online just a couple of weeks ago about somebody commenting sheer intensity of what it takes to get anything done in this world. If you think about even as something as simple as building a house for a single family, the amount of bureaucracy you have to go through, the amount of work you have to do to save up the money to go and do so. And then you start to think about the bigger institutions like setting up the schooling system or starting a new religion or a church or even just a company, being an entrepreneur, this sheer force of will it takes to do anything. You really have to be motivated and an optimist in order to actually play that role, to be that playable character going forward. Have I articulated your position correctly, or am I putting words in your mouth that are just quite antithetical to your actual philosophy here?
I would consider my philosophy a very optimistic one. I consider this an optimistic view of history because it suggests the future isn't written already. We are in the process of writing it. Now, there is a pessimistic element to it, because while I do believe that people from all walks of life might end up resolving key social problems, that is, introducing new social technologies to society, I do have to say only a small number of individuals end up having this outsized impact. So the optimism in the great founder view is that it is possible to innovate and change your society, and that ultimately the future of human society is decided by those that manage to engage in this type of innovation, that manage to introduce new practices, new types of organization, new politics, new religion, new whatever into their society. But however, I think most of us kind of are passengers. Honestly, though, because we choose it. Very few people are truly motivated to do something new or unique or truly pro-social for the sake of doing it. It's actually an extremely difficult life path. It's much easier and challenging enough, to be fair, to just live a good life in society as it exists, right? It's really, who's going to embark on the labor of decades to really re-engineer their society, even if it's just not profitable, even if it's not that fun, even if actually you get a lot of pushback, you're often lonely, you even might suffer political or religious persecution. Let's be honest, many of these individuals historically suffered quite severe persecution. So yes, hopeful on agency, sort of pessimistic on the ability of society to accept and absorb innovation. It does happen, but there's a struggle to make it happen.
Yeah, I do tend to agree with that points of view. I also want to get your perspective as to what are some of those pivotal examples that you can point to. I think you mentioned Charlemagne and Confucius, if I recall correctly. What institutions can you actually point to validate this theory to the audience today?
Right. I think for Confucius, it's straightforwardly the molding of a completely new type of professionalism. The molding of the professionalism of the Chinese state bureaucrat, right? The sort of poet bureaucrat that's supposed to know the human soul, is supposed to know history, and is supposed to humanely orient the world to be better, right? So their duty, of course, is obedience to the emperor, but it's also a duty to all of these classical Confucian values, to upholding filial piety, to sort of upholding the way of things. If you're going to have a society administered by bureaucrats, this is almost, the most humanistic philosophy you can come up with. I warmly recommend to people to just read some of the works attributed to Confucius. Confucius himself also understood his program to be one of social repair, right? He was introducing a philosophy that he argued was a return to the practices of the early Zhao dynasty. There's very little evidence of that. I think he was reinventing something to address the severe problems that Chinese civilization and society was experiencing during his life, and honestly, even many decades before he was even born. The so-called Warring States period, right, where the Zhao dynasty had slowly started breaking apart into these feudal fiefdoms, and eventually these went to war with each other. Almost interminably. Lots of people died, lots of economic damage, lots of knowledge was lost. And he saw himself as restoring sort of the golden age, but this is kind of the thing. Whenever you are restoring something, you're reverse engineering it, you're reinventing it inevitably because you're missing pieces. And I think he achieved something truly new. And even though his philosophy wasn't immediately adopted, he successfully founded just this group of scholars that followed him around the country, like dozens, maybe hundreds. And those scholars and their students ended up achieving the Confucian plan that he personally didn't achieve, which was, to approach the ruler. And once you are working with the ruler, you first write things in the imperial court, and then things are righted one step out in the state, and then things are well in all of society. In a way, a top-down approach, but a top-down approach that if you compare it to, say, something like legalism, with its belief in the inherent badness of people, in the need for strict punishment, for like almost, these very Spartan-like rules where if, you're marching your army somewhere and there are heavy rains and you're late, the punishment for being late with your army to the emperor is still death. That, by the way, happened. That was one of the causes of the rebellion that brought down the legalist philosophy Qin dynasty and replaced it eventually with the Han dynasty. That incorporated these students of Confucius, not his biological children and grandchildren, but his intellectual children and grandchildren. And they basically carried out the plan. They were well educated in the classics, they understood administration, and they had ethical ideals that they held each other to. And this means that, this was a whole new mode of doing civil administration. Importantly, too, it was meritocratic. Anyone could become such a scholar. They implemented these imperial exam systems as well, which were not tied to your ancestry. So China, because of Confucianism, firmly transitioned away from like a feudal structure almost to a very, let's say at first, meritocratic structure. Inevitably it decays and the tests get worse and the bureaucrats less idealistic, etc. And the system is just like full of terrible graft and bribery and corruption and all of that. But then that's why you have a new dynasty every 200 or 300 years. And that dynasty every 200 or 300 years mostly hires Confucian scholars to just reboot the whole process. And China's gone through this, I think something like 4 different waves of various Confucian educated scholars. In fact, one of the big debates about modern China is, will it become Confucian? And sometimes this is considered in the West sort of scary, but I honestly think it would be the best possible outcome for the Chinese Communist Party to embrace more Confucian values. I think it would make it more meritocratic, more fair, less oppressive. It still wouldn't be a democracy, but that's sort of what I think. Now, I talked a lot about Confucius. I can pause a little bit before I talk about Charlemagne, but to simplify it, a social reform movement with a blueprint for how to educate administrators and a plan of action to have these administrators transform all of society, which they do, they did. Confucian values are very deeply educated into the general population, even surviving the Cultural Revolution to a great extent.
Yeah, the points you raised there are a bit uncomfortable, particularly with people that come from the Western consensus and all the rest of it, because it forces you to confront the idea that democracy is perhaps a low bar kind of a utopia, right? Not necessarily the most efficient or the most durable system in the long run, because what the Confucian system has proven to be is both durable and efficient, which is not comfortable for a sort of a generation or several generations that have grown up kind of thinking that common consensus is the way forward. So how do you reconcile those thoughts, right? Because the subtext here is that autocracy is perhaps more efficient and more effective at moving the needle than slow-moving sort of social democracy, which is very kumbaya, but not necessarily a fit competitor in the ring of ideas. And like to point to that, you can kind of just look at the histogram, which I'm sure many of you have looked at, that wonderful infographic that kind of shows how civilizations have ebbed and flowed throughout history. And China is really the only unbroken line on that map. Now, of course, there are questions around sort of dynamism there versus sort of resilience, and what it is that we want to optimize for. So my question to you is a very direct question, is when it comes to great founder theory, when you kind of look at what a great founder is Is a great founder someone who moves the needle significantly, that creates change, or is it someone who sustains change, or is it a combination of both when you are evaluating whether a founder is great or not in that context? And of course, we do understand the word great is not equivalent to the word good. They don't have to be joined together. They can be both separate or combined.
Yeah, I appreciate this nuance. Often I have to introduce that nuance, so it's great to be at a venue where that can be taken for granted, right? Great means high impact. Impact can be very positive, or even very negative. I think it's the case that, again, to keep everything the same, you often have to change everything. We are in our lives, in the grandest scale, always stuck in the Red Queen race, right? Where you have to go as fast as you can just to stay in the exact same place. To give examples from recent history, during the Cold War, to keep up in the arms race between the US and the USSR, both sides had to invest truly massive amounts into their armaments, had to pursue breakthrough science, had to acquire new strategic resources. And then let us consider economic competition, and the case makes itself there. And if we imagine something like even religious revival, societies do not always stay in the same state of religious ferment, right? If that was, for example, your goal, obviously you want people to very piously follow whatever teachings your religion has in mind for them. But if you look at societies, they actually go through these very interesting cycles of zealotry and impiety, cynicism, followed by zealotry again, sometimes in the same religion. Like in America, you had these great religious revivals that came every few decades in the 19th and 20th century. Or say in the Islamic world, you had more and less pious caliphs who were often a sign of the times, right? Some caliphs, apparently even had wine served at their palaces and so on, something you're definitely not supposed to do. But like the popes, they would sometimes have a good time. You have privilege, you use it. The most interesting point to me about the question of, say, democracy, right, versus autocracy, if I know it's not quite the question you asked, so I'm saying big impact can be measured through something lasting for a very long time, adapting to the world, having like a steady nudge that accumulates over time, or to a sudden expansion and sudden explosion where it kind of resets the board. I've often debated with myself, for example, if Genghis Khan was a great founder or not. I sort of like, you can go back and forth, right? You can say that he changed the way Mongols did politics, waged war, many centuries of impact, obviously changed the Eurasian continent immensely. But then on the other hand, steppe nomads were less and less relevant in the centuries after. So it's something I go back and forth on, right? But to the point on democracy and autocracy, I would say the most functional version of democracy is one where individual forces or parts of a plural society, right? Communities, cities, ethnic minorities, whatever, where they each are allowed to do great things and transform all of society without necessarily needing the consensus of everyone, right? Almost no democratic decision is ever achieved through consensus, because the only way to achieve consensus is to, make everyone agree. There are very few topics on which everyone agrees. Rather, the more advanced theory of democracy, that's classical political science, but I think today is almost sort of forgotten, is this idea of pluralism, and maybe even functional pluralism, where different elements of society try different things. I do think currently Western democracies are dysfunctional, so it's no wonder that we forget this more sensible version of democracy. And also currently, and I say this again with this kind of, this can be good or bad, currently China is a rather functional autocracy. This is not to say that there don't exist dysfunctional autocracies. Obviously they do, right? And it also is not saying anything about the strength or weakness of either. But I do think it explains a few things about our historical moment and why we're seeing the things we're seeing. It's perhaps not even a contest between democracy and autocracy, but just functionality and dysfunctionality.
It was interesting what you said about Genghis Khan there, that he doesn't quite make your grade, because by putting it out there, you kind of setting the bar very, very high in terms of how long that impact has to run for. I mean, you're talking about them sort of fading away over the next few centuries. So you're talking about lasting change, meaning really lasting in order to
well,
really
did he invent a new way of being? Did he invent a new type of society? Or was he just really good at executing what steppe nomads had always done? Right. So that's sort of the interesting point here, where it's like, if I evaluate a great general and I'm like, oh, this is an amazing general, clearly important for so many battles, is he a great founder? My question is going to be not how many battles did he win or how big were the battles, but how did he reform the military? How did he govern the territories, if he governed them at all, that he conquered? How did he change officer training, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So Napoleon, I think he's kind of a great founder, but not because he was that good at conquering Europe, but just because of the way the French state was reformed and the way the changes of revolutionary France were exported all over the continent. Even after Napoleon was defeated and the French Revolution was defeated, so many of the laws, economic structures, administrative structures innovated in Napoleonic France were kept. Even as the old kings returned, right? They just used the same infrastructure, social, government, economic. Exactly, right? So I'm sort of like, what did Genghis Khan do that lasted super long, right? Like, I think maybe some politics in the Mongols. Exactly.
So it is a high bar. So that brings me to another question, which is perhaps slightly unfair, because it makes you look a bit further ahead. Who was our last great founder? That's part one of the question. And that you can point to, that you're quite confident will continue on. And the second one is, has our rate of producing great founders as a global society slowed down or sped up as our population has grown? Because we generally tend to think that growth and new ideas come from growth, but have the changes we've been making in those great founders become bigger and more, or have they become more incremental, less great?
Well, this is a very good question. Yes, the world population is larger than ever, but it's not clear we have more great founders than ever. I would say that perhaps our societies have become too homogenized, too standardized, and too centralized. This means that the kind of life experience that would allow you to sort of train yourself up into a great founder, right? The result might be that you are already violating rules of society on step one or step two before you have any great impact, or that you're thoroughly demoralized, or that you're redirected into sort of a dead end, right? Like you said at one point earlier that to build a house has, there's a lot of bureaucracy to it. But you know what, as far as I can tell, if I got the raw material together, I could build a house. The bureaucracy getting in the way does not seem strictly necessary to the material object of the house existing. What if everything in our society is like this? We've made so many rules of safety to stop ourselves from doing things, right? And when I say make a house personally, like this is not even that recent. My grandparents, who admittedly, they're a bit older because my dad is a bit older and, they passed on. They literally made their own bricks for the house that they built. And this was like in the 1930s. It was like mildly eccentric. They were known in the village for doing that. That was considered like very hard work. But you know what? Like an individual could build a house, like could make the bricks, could, put them in the furnace and everything. Like I laid some bricks as like a kid as well. And like, did all sorts of fun physical things. So really what I'm saying here is we don't have necessarily the best means to capture the human potential of everyone. Okay. Yeah. It's great to hear kids in the background, by the way. I'm so happy to see some parents out there. I also have 2 boys, 6 and 3.
I was just going to say that it would have been so hypocritical of us to come together and talk about the future without children. It's one of the things that I think our generations are relearning, that, oh, if you actually want to have a future, maybe make babies. It's like a good way to innovate.
Degrowth on the brain, which is kind of the opposite of great founder, right? So unless that's the great shift, right? So that was the other part of my question. Who can you point to as being the most recent great founder?
Yeah, it's a,
Your examples were very far back in time.
well, we went super far back in time, but Napoleon's pretty recent. The historical verdict is still out on so many people. My favorite example of a recent great founder who I think we'll still see how long the foundations that he laid will last. I feel it might just be Charles de Gaulle. I think he brought back a defeated nation into a position of strength. Now, France is not a superpower. Apologies to any French people listening, but it is still
Don't
a
tell
power.
them. Don't tell them.
Well, they don't know. We're speaking in English, right? So they can't tell. It's okay. But it's quite plausible to me that he relayed the foundations of French statehood and was a pivotal player in the creation of the European Union. And that's like perhaps an impact for the next 500 years. He also made a French republican system that, for better or worse, seems to work. The French have not been experiencing revolutions and instability as they did in the 19th century. They finally sort of made peace, perhaps, with the constant flip of republic to monarchy, empire, republic, et cetera, right? I think, the strong presidential executive, the relatively centralized administration, but still the strong focus on technical excellence and high technology, while maintaining a real democracy, that's kind of a unique recipe. But like I said, sort of the jury's still out on him. And I think we will see how well France does over the next 100 years.
Breakthroughs in that direction. We do have a question from Stefan. Would you like to ask it before we move on to the live versus dead players, which we're leading towards this evening?
Sure. Hi, Samo. Speaking of kids, my question is, do you see any societies that are more receptive to great founders or maybe live players? And what would make a society more receptive to them?
Well, there are two interesting questions. How receptive is a society to taking in innovation in general, which almost necessarily makes it receptive to great founders? And the other question is, how tolerant is society of the kind of people who tend to become great founders? Honestly, today, whatever you think of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, if you ever read about him, it's hard not to get the sense that he wouldn't just be a cranky blogger if he were born today. Like he would just be like an angry blogger. He would be picking beefs. He would be writing these invectives. It's not clear he would sort of get any elite sponsorship, right? Let alone like this big following behind him. Or maybe he would, but I just think it's a little bit less likely. And let's talk a little bit about why, right? I think the great founder type is always very eccentric. They almost have to be. They have to both be in touch with the moment which they are in, the society they are in, yet be not of it. Almost everyone is fully like a fish in water, doesn't even realize that the norms of their society are what they are, or they are so disconnected. So, what's the American term? A space cadet, right? Or disconnected from social reality, that even if they have brilliant ideas, they have no way to bridge that gap. And it's actually a great feat of moral, emotional, intellectual labor to do it. And any mind, any individual that can do this, any small group of people, these are people under immense strain. And, some of them might, like Joan of Arc, have beliefs that they're receiving divine inspiration. They might even, for all we know, be receiving divine inspiration, or they just might look pretty crazy, right? They might seem pretty crazy, possibly because they are. Yeah, Joan of Arc would be on TikTok, someone commented. That's brilliant. That's a great way to put it. So what I would say is we need to accept some measure of eccentricity in our leaders. And I actually think we're fairly bad at this. We sort of prefer people who lie to us that they are just like us, rather than people who could be as eccentric or as interesting as they are. Why do all American politicians feel almost sort of interchangeable, replaceable? Because they all try very, very hard to fit a mold. And maybe, even that's what we want in politics. Maybe we want politics to be boring. But what happens when we want politics to be boring, and science to be boring, and economics to be boring, and the CEOs of big companies to be boring, and the religious leaders to be boring? Then everyone is boring, right? Currently, we kind of tolerate eccentricity in musicians, and even musicians are only allowed to be eccentric in some ways. I would say we used to tolerate more eccentricity in scientists, right? Like, Albert Einstein was considered eccentric, but he became so famous, he kind of refactored everyone's idea of what a scientist is supposed to look like. So every scientist, at least a physicist that has a public presence, to some extent is LARPing, is acting the role of a mini Einstein. Today, a truly non-conforming scientist would look very different than Einstein, because the norm has been changed by the nonconformist, as always happens through history. Hope that goes a little bit to answer your question. And then the other part of the first one would be, I just think societies that embrace growth coming from many different directions, I think, city-states were actually, as far as I can tell, like the best sort of socio-political economic architecture for accepting great contributions, right? Because you have this very fragmented system, and a lot of innovation can happen, philosophical, economic, and otherwise. Renaissance Italy and ancient classical Greece, I think, are two good examples.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to pick up on what you said a little bit earlier about, that perhaps some of the reasons why our great founder selection process or ability to create them has slowed down is because our societies become too homogenized and too globalized. I think that picks up also on what you said a little bit earlier when you were talking about the whole Red Queen thing, which comes back to Matt Ridley's book, The Red Queen, where he spoke about the Red Queen process of how you run faster and faster to stay in the same place. But he also came to the conclusion that is very much in a very basic sort of evolutionary kind of way. What we need in society is both collaboration and conflict, and you kind of need to find a balance between the two, because you can have too much anarchy on the other hand and also end up with nothing really getting resolved because everyone's putting out fires all the time, which I think an interesting point for this particular moment in time, where we are questioning ideas of centralization versus decentralization on very grand playing fields, whether it's on the economic sense with what's going on with DeFi, whether it's on the political sense with the rise of China, as you've spoken about. That the middle ground seems to actually be the sweet spot, which is the hardest spot to hold, right? Because we like to sort of pull in one of those two directions. But as we do that, we give up some efficiency in terms of some sort of resilience, and we give up some safety and for some freedom, we give up a little bit of the converse. So how do you hold that balance in a world like this? How do you find a balance between conflicts and collaboration? How do you give people enough rope to play, but not enough rope to hang themselves, right? Because the more anarchist states here in Africa are also like absolutely no fun to live in, and you're certainly not going to get great founders rising up in the middle of a kingdom is run by essentially warlords still running around, or in my society, which is rapidly breaking down with our more and more frequent insurrections, right? Like the whole defund law and order to a certain extent only works so far.
And the way infrastructure failure and so on. I mean, I just want to also note that societies do undergo periods of decline. And maybe, this is obvious to anyone who saw sort of, for some societies, perhaps they should undergo decline. Anyone who's seen sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union, perhaps you kind of wish it happened in a better way, but almost everyone was eventually sort of glad that that sort of system ended up changing significantly in Eastern Europe. I think the balance is if I understand the question correctly, I think the balance here, I think it's not even between real safety. I think it's really something much more basic. It's sort of like, in the name of safety, societies sometimes do very dangerous things. You know, I brought up the Soviet Union. Consider its response and the factors that led to the Chernobyl disaster. These were very bureaucratic, very procedural decisions that made a technically incorrect decision, and then a somewhat failed reactive response to the ongoing crisis of the Chernobyl power plant. And the best sort of, skill that they demonstrated was some ability to control the narrative, to control information, but even that didn't work very well. So I'm gonna again turn to COVID. How much actual safety did did we get for some of the extreme COVID measures that we undertook? How much actual virus spread did we stop?
It's just one life. With that justification, you can justify absolutely anything. It's like the grand old
Exactly.
utilitarian ethics thing that sooner or later can justify torturing one kid under the sea to keep everybody else in a state of perpetual bliss, right? I mean, like, if you follow that chain of logic all the way down, it gets quite dark quite quickly.
And of course, I'm not minimizing COVID. Like, even now that we're post-COVID, I'm sort of like, yeah, it's a serious health problem. There are many, many people dying because of it right now. They didn't stop dying just because we stopped freaking out about it. They continue to die in the background as they die of many other diseases, unfortunately.
But it's the inadvertent, responses of bureaucratic decisions that are taken for good intentions, even. Like, it's not even, we don't even have to assume bad intentions, that have perverse effects that are by not thinking through all the unintended consequences. I think one of my favorite ones is what happened with prohibition. Like, we had prohibition during COVID in my country. It lasted a very long time, killed a lot of industries. But what they actually found is that there was more alcohol related illnesses because people were then binge drinking and they could get their hands on those sorts of products. I mean, we knew these lessons from the original prohibition, right? And I think it also, Sephora, to take the examples away from COVID, which is still a very contentious issue, and of course everybody has their own opinions on that. I just always reminded by the French style. Well,
whether you're pro or con, you will have your failures in mind, either the too slow vaccine rollout or the like overly harsh lockdowns. Like, no matter what position one takes, one has spotted some failures.
The only point is that there are unintended consequences to even the best laid intentions, and quite often top-down solutions don't fit. And that's why I love the French rules to work strike, right? Where you do exactly what you're told to do, and you follow all the rules, and you basically drive the business to a complete standstill by being the perfect worker, which just kind of shows that in a completely organized system, there's no room for resilience when anything goes wrong. And I just absolutely love that as an actual form of passive aggressive resistance against bureaucracy, just following the bureaucracy entirely and just seeing how things slow down to a complete halt. Not intended that way, but these systems are often designed to function in perfect conditions. And there's always contingencies that we can't see. But we're definitely moving away from the topic at hand. So let me do my job and bring it back. And Anish has a question. Would you like to ask it before we move on? Anish, are you there?
Anish.
Hi, audible?
Yes.
Can you? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good to see you after a long time. So I had a few points. I just wanted your response. But I'm not gonna, like, if it takes too much, we can just move on. One thing I did wanted to note, a set of related things actually, was that there seems to be something, and a friend of mine observed this, there seems to be something really weird going on, mostly in Anglo societies actually, about the combination of the idea of equality and cultivation and a sense of disempowerment. As in, there's a wide variety of things that a person can just learn to do and do pretty decently in around 20 to 100 hours. And almost none of these seem to be psychologically available to pretty much anyone. And once you start noticing it, it's really noticeable, as in you realize, wait a minute, so I could have achieved maybe better, for example, outcomes across the board, say in my career, by, sinking 5 to 10 hours into learning how to negotiate, for instance, right?
Mhm.
Except that is objectively not somebody that anyone ever does, except maybe a very few people. And this is not just negotiating, I'm saying just pretty much anything. And there seems to be some sort of implicit taboo about admitting that I could be significantly better than maybe my past self or some random Joe Schmo who has not put in these 10 hours, for example. Like there seems to be something, so this is with respect to what you mentioned about people not like having to violate their society's taboos in order to try to be a live player of any kind whatsoever. And it's like, if you can't be a live player enough to put in 5 or 10 hours into something that could give you $100,000 over the span of maybe 3 years, if you're a software engineer, let's say, then forget live player. I mean, you're not even playing your own life, so to speak. So, and the blocks, this is the second point that I have observed in people in the Bay Area, and people who, as far as I can tell, ability-wise, right, are the cream of the crop. Okay. The blocks seem to be mostly psychological, as in there's nothing preventing many of these people from either individually or in groups, in small groups, doing significant things. And it's just, it does not happen because of a variety of psychological factors, and they seem to be the primary limiters. And I don't know how these two are limited. I just wanted to sort of get your view on this, because I think you've been exposed to the same milieu that I'm talking about. So you probably have some sense of what I'm speaking of.
I've lived on and off in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, and so on for 8 years now. So yes, somewhat am exposed to this. I can comment on the narrow cultural phenomena a little bit and then tie it to the relevance to the topics we were discussing. You know, I think it just in a very real way, we are all hyper socialized, deeply socialized to a certain kind of almost, kind of if you do things exactly right, you're going to get a reward. And if you don't do things exactly right, you won't get a reward. And the reward is dispensed by some sort of bureaucratic body. So what I'm saying essentially is, I think we are over-schooled. And I think school rewards a very narrow focus in a way, especially if it's not a well-done school. And I think for many people in the Bay Area, they're very smart. They internalize this kind of rule following, and the rule set is not actually that advanced. It's not actually that broad. And what they are getting is rewarding them to a certain extent. If they happen to be the people working in tech, they have a bunch of money, usually. The money doesn't necessarily buy that much, right? Even now, they barely started doing anything politically, just barely started, even though there was immense problem with housing and all sorts of other issues. So I think in that case, it's just, what happens when your specialists don't get the full breadth of the education, and where the education doesn't really produce free individuals, right? So it's that basic, I think, for the Bay. And then for the relevance for broader society, I think you obviously want your smartest people to be as active as possible, right? You want your smartest people to be as agentic as possible. Now, there are some political problems here where I could point to the late Roman Republic as a period where very smart people were very ambitious, and then the result is political instability because they're all competing over political power. But modulo that key problem of political order, like if you can solve that to some extent through some mechanism, you want them to be as agentic as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Do you need to take a break there, or can we continue, Samo?
Just very quickly, I had some minor technical glitch here.
Sure, No problem.
Yeah.
Let's move on now to the actual sort of key topic that we wanted to discuss today, which was the live versus dead players, which we've alluded to, but let's just give you the floor to explain exactly what you meant by that. You've obviously written about the subject and how that links into the great founder theory. What do you mean when you're speaking about live versus dead players in today's context?
Yeah, live players are basically just people who can respond to circumstances as they arise, rethinking things from first principles or just a really well-honed gut level intuition. Dead players are people who follow a preset script. It can even be a very high quality script. So one can easily be a dead player and still be a top performer. Why do I frame them in terms of players? Well, because you have to think about a game. Live versus dead players is a lens that helps you think through a game. You imagine a political setting, an economic setting, right? Two companies competing. Who's going to win? Well, identify who's the live player and who's the dead player. Why? Because the live player can always read the dead player's rule book and then just do something more. The dead player can't really predict what the live player will do. In fact, live players cannot predict what live players will do. All they can do is proactively, dynamically respond to it. So if you have a competition of dead players, you look at all of their fundamentals and you bet on the one with the best fundamental. If it's countries competing, the biggest army, the most natural resources, whatever. As soon as you introduce a live player, they might still lose, right? There's nothing really, they might get taken out too early in the game. But if you have like a fairly reasonable contender and they're a live player, the advantage is so outsized, it's just not even funny. I think it usually, either economically, politically, or in any other domain, you kind of need a live player to beat a live player. And a dead player will just tend to lose. Now, this is not to say that live and dead player exist only in a zero-sum context. It can obviously exist in a positive sum context. And I especially think why we want and need live players in society is to basically chart out new resources and new possibilities to free the rest of us from the inevitable competition over scarcity. Because even if we eliminate physical scarcity, we are still faced with social scarcity, psychological scarcity, and so on. Scarcity of knowledge. So live players, in a way, the scripts are going from one to many, and live players go from 0 to 1.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because ultimately all value, that is why we want things, comes from a degree of scarcity, right? So by eliminating scarcity, that gets us to really, if that's a goal, to question.
I think
what
we are
next,
stuck
right?
almost a priori
We'll find something new
with certain kinds of scarcity. We will create them.
Yeah, because we both crave to overcome it, but we also want that which everyone else cannot have. That is what sort of drives us forward, right? The pursuit of scarcity going forward, which is that's an interesting way to look at it. But that is a good also frame for where live players will be focusing their attention on minimizing or maximizing scarcity levels for various different reasons. So I think it's probably a useful frame to think about where the action is going to come from next in those spaces. But when it comes to these live versus dead players, well, I think it's particularly useful to think about why we need live players in a game is that when it comes to sort of management theory, there's a kind of theory that says that you kind of got 3 degrees of risk that you can try and plot your courses of action from. You've got risk, uncertainty, and chaos, right? Risk, you've got known odds and known outcomes. Uncertainty, you've got a known set of outcomes, but you've got unknown odds for all of those outcomes. And in chaos, you've got unknown odds and unknown outcomes. And if you're a dead player, which is essentially running off an automated script, there's just no way for you to compete in a chaotic system. You can only really compete in a risk-based system. Even an uncertainty-based system, the live player is going to have a key advantage over you. And I think the point is that there's very few known odds, known outcomes games, whether those are economic games, whether those are political games. Almost all of them are at least in the uncertainty field, but the really important ones are way out in the chaotic space, which means you have to be bringing something random to the table or you're very quickly going to get figured out. And then of course you're at a huge disadvantage. which brings us back to current context and in society today. And you spoke about live players on quite an individual basis, like people that are able to adapt and people that had not running off a script. But this also applies to organizations and to nation states. And I know you've written about that to a certain extent. Do you want to elaborate a bit on how you feel who the live players are in the great global game right now? And feel free to pick out either the individuals or the organizations and nation states who you see as being live and actively playable at this point in time. And then we can get into the converse, the not so playable characters.
Right. In a way, organizations can be live players if they're sort of piloted by live players, if they're dynamic enough. I think, today, just looking around the world politically, unfortunately, sort of the caliber of statesmen in the world is just not what it was 60 or 70 years ago. Whatever you think of World War II, the figures there seem almost larger than life. Whether you think of Winston Churchill or if you think of Joseph Stalin, honestly, even if you think of Mussolini, whatever political problems existed, obviously in social, humanitarian, etc., obviously he was a brilliant politician just in his ascent to power. And maybe Italy itself didn't do that well, but the point being, the individual leader was something of a live player, right? Just as was Winston Churchill, just as was FDR, and ultimately even de Gaulle, who I mentioned earlier, can be considered a World War II era leader. 1960s has something of a similar dynamic, right? I don't know why exactly, but today it's sort of like people who would be kind of mediocre statesmen in the 19th century, right? Statespeople, I guess. They seem to be the best that are around. And now, whatever one thinks of Vladimir Putin, I think he is a live player. How many predictions that he would be ousted out of power have been disproven in the past few months? This doesn't mean Russia is going to achieve great or excellent long-term objectives, but I do think he is an unpredictable and, for the most part, successfully self-interested political leader. So he's an example. I think Xi, to a significant degree, is also an example. I think in the Western world, there's an interesting opening, because I think these societies could respond very well to a live player, but I just see so few of them. I think there's a question raised by Anna.
Yeah, there are very few people auditioning for the role of live player or great founder,
or some of them that did audition
founder.
Ended up being disappointing. Right.
And we've definitely seen that where I live in South Africa, where we have this massive political vacuum. We have a completely apathetic voting generation that's not interested in going to the polls at all. And the only people that are playing the political game are the elderly and aging. And what we have is we have a lot of, wars and rumors of wars, or the equivalent in the local political scene of potentially dangerous political characters. But I'm not worried about any of them, because none of them appeal to the great disenchanted masses. They are only playing to the very small peanut gallery, which represents a very small sector of society, which is never going to be the revolutionary segment. We're talking about sort of your most radical, both left and right players, kind of all pandering towards the 40 plus demographic, which is never going to be the ones that turn
in a way
society.
we are
so dangerous.
We are a very gerontocratic society, right? We were very old, or a lot of societies have become very old.
There's more over 35s than under 35s globally. We're not young anymore.
I just wanted to add that, for the longest time, I had hopes for Macron, especially because he seemed to have some vitality, flexibility, but now I worry that it's mostly PR. Now, he did win his second term in France, but I'm not seeing any great strategic wins for France yet. So he is disappointed. He's an example, say, of a politician that, if you asked me 2 or 3 years ago, I've been, probably a live player. Now I kind of think he probably isn't.
if we have so few live players, isn't that a very dangerous place to be? Because anyone can kind of step up into that Messiah, Antichrist kind of a role, right? So you've got a hungry generation that's looking for anyone to follow, but there's just no options on the table. The menu is very scarce, which means anything new and spicy is likely to attract attention, even if it's not particularly great, even if it's just slightly more exciting than mediocre. People are so hungry for anything here. Isn't that a very dangerous state to be? Because you've already spoken about the fact that it seems like that greatness position has cooled off a bit, that we should be seeing more of it based purely on numbers, but clearly something's cooled us. But that cooling is not an inevitable process. It could be replaced by something maybe too hot to handle quite quickly, if someone spots that opportunity.
Well, it's interesting, right? I think we are compounding systemic risk at every level of society. So I don't, however, necessarily think that we are in for political upheavals, more political failures. Let me say why I think that. I mentioned just a few minutes ago that a lot of the developed countries, and more some of the countries that are still developing, are very old. Societies that are very old with a high average age tend to be societies that don't like to change much, and are societies that have less political violence and less economic activity. So imagine things sort of slowly and sadly falling apart with a few intermittent disasters, but no fundamental political change or economic or social change. I almost feel that's the most pessimistic scenario I can paint. Sort of not with a bang, but with a whimper.
How do you die? Slowly or suddenly? Which do you prefer? Die young in your prime?
Well, I think most of the time, when you hope society rises from the ashes like a phoenix, it really didn't. It just died. So I do think fires are bad. But if it did have to rise like a phoenix from the flames, that would be preferable to sort of slowly rotting away like an old wooden structure being overgrown. I also even very much would endorse a sort of reform, a sort of society-wide revival where we reverse engineer and rebuild some of the good elements of our societies that really worked quite well until recently.
Yeah, that's something to pause for thought on. Anna, you had a question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's also a discussion going on in the chat, but I'm not going to repeat that part. What interests me, Samo, is, when I first read your essay about live players and net players, the startup founder in me immediately got on her feet and was like, let's do this. Let's live play today. But there was this feeling behind, somewhere in my mind, that, okay, where does morality come in here? I mean, it's very clear from your article that, in many, many cases, the good guys are boring and they are as dead as can be, right? And many people vote for the good guys because it's like good boring, the continuity and whatnot. Probably this is how long-lasting monarchies survive. They bring the game, the dead game, and we're fine. And then you go and do some other stuff that's interesting in your life. But this, to me, kind of brings up the fundamental question of whether we can create political binaries or dichotomies completely disregarding the morality angle. To me, as a good Aristotelian, politics is about morality. It's not just about innovation. It's not just about breaking the rules. It's not just about not being coddled. It's about, will you do good for people? Will your, to go back to the Confucian system, will your people be prosperous, therefore peaceful? And I'm wondering how you think about, is this a 2x2 for you, that they are live, dead, good, bad, and then everybody kind of falls somewhere on that? How do you think about that? And I hope this is not a too provocative question.
No, not at all. It's an important question. Successful startup founders are life players, usually, especially the sort of first and second generation of startup founders in the last few years. I don't even need to name examples because we just all can think of examples, right? Yeah, so it comes to the morality, it's rather tricky. We can judge people by the consequence of their actions. That's almost the easiest one. That's why the utilitarians, often have a certain popular appeal among educated intellectuals, even among people who tend to be in the bureaucratic class. You might say, oh, this particular person was an authoritarian leader, but they developed their country and lifted it out of poverty. Who am I talking about here? I'm talking about Lee Kuan Yew, right? The development of Singapore, right, from this backwater city in the developing world to basically being a first world city. He even wrote his autobiography is from third world to first, right? How many other countries can boast of that development, right? So if you judge him in a utilitarian perspective, he's obviously good. If you judge him in a sort of political, more virtue ethics perspective, he becomes more questionable because he would often suspend procedure and rule of law and all sorts of other things in pursuit of what was probably, understood or thought by the people working most closely with him, the greater good of Singapore. But that definitely remained his judgment and the judgment of his closest associates. I think that there's a temptation to merely evaluate all leaders by the outcome of their actions. So I would say that when it comes to morality, I think of it, okay, I evaluate live or dead player. Live player presumably has bigger impact. I evaluate the consequences of their action, but I still also ultimately, especially in a live player, try as best as I can to come to an evaluation of the character of a person. Like the question of, is someone actually a good person? With a live player becomes even more important because I think live players are much harder to constrain than people usually believe, right? If we make something really difficult for live players to do, they'll go do something else. And in that different domain, they'll be just as unconstrained as they would have been in the first domain. There might be a very good reason why, for example, we, at a certain point in history, a certain state of politics might not want live players in politics, but then they'll show up in the economy. Or if we don't allow them in the economy, maybe they'll show up in the arts. Or if we don't allow them in arts, maybe they'll show up in science. And one of my worries was that we've shut down all the fields or too many of the fields. So they can't even pivot properly, whether or not they're good or bad. And with that, it's sort of like the cell regeneration of society, the renewal function stops working because we kind of need them to reset our scripts every now and then. Otherwise, all aspects of our lives are governed by script following. So the nuance that I would propose here is that all else equal, it's good for a society to allow enough live players to rejuvenate itself and adapt itself to circumstance. But having said that, yes, of course, one shouldn't just always cheer on a live player. One should look at the consequences of their actions. And separate of this, also sort of the content of their character. I mean, note, someone could be a great humanitarian in terms of their achievements, but if you judge their character is actually not good, you might still not want to work for them, even if your goal is great impact, just as a personal decision, because you expect to be burned because they don't take care of their allies, for example, right? Okay, I hope that touches on that question and
yeah,
starts to answer it.
Absolutely, and thank you so much. And this is just kind of pure physics, right? To go back to your original field, like if somebody has a bigger impact, then they will have a bigger impact, positively and negatively, and you have to be a little bit more careful.
Right.
But I love this idea. Sorry?
Like technology, right? Like we shouldn't shy away from the powerful stuff just because it could be used badly. But at the same time, you have to be consciously cognizant of directing it towards productive, not destructive elements. I mean, of course, nuclear is the classic example there, but there's so much of potential out there that we're shutting down, we're not even having conversations about. I was in Berlin like a week ago for the Republica conference, and it was so depressing because it was 4 days of people complaining about what could go wrong, and there wasn't one person that spoke about what could go right. And like they clearly there was no live players in that on that speaker lineup.
Welcome
Like
to
they were
Europe.
clearly all. It was I was so excited because I'm coming back to Africa to speak at a different conference this week, and everyone's excited about the future here and what could go right. So I was like, well, we've got a lot more live players.
Yeah,
in
go where the live players are.
Yeah,
It's so interesting about eras, like what in every era there is one area where the remaining live players will kind of congregate, and it changes. And to me, that's really, really interesting. You know, when you read about the downfall of American journalism, for instance, like it's no longer a playground for the most innovative minds, and politics definitely isn't. I have a follow-up question, short follow-up questions to Samo. One is, do you have any ambition to inspire the best and brightest, the live players to go back into politics, or do you see that as too dangerous because like it can go both ways? And do you have maybe a system of thought that you're very inspired by, where you see this live player, dead player dichotomies somehow show up, but also the moral angle?
Well, it's my great hope that in all areas of social function, I can, in my small way, contribute to the success of live players. Because like I said, my diagnosis for society overall is that we've shut down live players too much. This is not to deny the problems with particular live players, let's say, right? It just seems to me that we are engaged in a structural risk where, you know, it's sort of one way to think of it is like Californian forests, right? If you let natural fires go through every few years, you're doing okay. But then you start putting out fires, and more flammable material accumulates in the forest. So when the fire breaks out, it's truly disastrous and ends up killing the forest, right? And not to mention blackening the sky, right? Turning it red, as we sometimes see in San Francisco. So what I think is we should allow small, dangerous live players to show up and occasionally even mess things up, if this means we have more live players who show up and fix those messes, right? And it's a question of where exactly can we as a society safely allow innovation? Do we necessarily want innovations in nuclear war strategy? Probably not. Probably that's not a game we want to advance further. Maybe it's good that that game is frozen. But do we want economic innovation, technological innovation? And yes, do we want media innovation? And yes, political innovation, say in city government? I think we do. I think we have pressing social problems. So I don't want to encourage anyone to go into politics. It's such a not grateful area. But I do encourage them to make areas their own. I do want them to try out things. I want them to be live players. Give it at least one shot in your life, like one shot. Take 5 years of your life, try to do something that's not tracked on any career, any flow chart, any advice piece. And you know, Anna, like, you know, Interintellect, that was not on any career guide path.
Tell me
That is a
about
unique
it.
creation. It's a unique
Yeah.
creation and a worthwhile one. And I think I want to encourage more and more people to be sort of live players right now. And my hope is that some of them create institutions that succeed in solving these problems. Once an institution is created, you actually don't need a live player to keep fixing that area. It just works. So we can almost relax in a way once the live players do their job. Maybe once society is like in a bit of a better state, I'll become the voice of caution. But for now, I'm sort of the voice of let's allow more individuals to give that their input to society, and maybe we'll see more great founders as a result.
So maybe we have too few at the moment, not too many. And there are points in history where we have too many people running around causing too much chaos, but that's not what's happening right now at the moment. But where from your perspective, and you can answer this geographically again, or by industry slice, where are you seeing the highest concentration of live players? Where are the pockets that you think we could have a renaissance or a revival in playerhood next?
Well, I think a few years ago, you had this really exciting ecosystem developing in China, in Shenzhen. I actually think the Chinese Communist Party made a massive mistake by punishing Jack Ma too much, because with this, they sent out a signal that the sort of technologist disruptor a la Silicon Valley that comes to start to think about big societal problems, that is not a welcomed archetype in Chinese society. So we'll see whether they have in fact sort of destroyed that technological ecosystem by destroying the idealism that also drives it and making it unacceptable to be the kind of flamboyant person that ends up being a founder. Silicon Valley, it gets a lot of bad press, but I actually still think it's one of the better places. I actually ironically think that we will see more cultural and financial innovation rather than technological innovation come out of the Bay Area in the coming years and decades. I note that still new companies emerge and new almost movements, intellectual movements emerge from that part of the world, right? You have philosophical movements like the effective altruists, like you have the rationalists, you have, like new models for media like Substack. I don't want to even call it a company. I think it's just a new model for how to fund writing and how to fund journalists. It would be a very different and interesting world where we had a healthy journalistic culture where it's actually just individuals. It's just individuals that are very much trusted, speaking to their audience, undertaking projects in their domain of expertise, like an unbundling, right? Where the big newspapers kind of fail, and then you have the individual journalists still be very well supported, perhaps paid better than ever, and doing their job better than ever, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an argument for Silicon Valley. And, I actually think that in Europe, Berlin is culturally underrated. So I think in Europe, Berlin is a good shot. I think the Indian diaspora, but not in India, is going to be sort of one of the next great sources of economic and cultural innovation as well. So I could expand it maybe to be the South Asian diaspora in general. I think Pakistan and Bangladesh also have some potential.
Looking at those that have left, not those that have stayed. That's
exactly.
That's very contrarian compared to what a lot of other people are saying about the next wave of innovation. But I like that. Do you have a justification behind that argument, or why you focused on the diaspora there? Because it is a bit of an.
I think on paper, India has immense potential. Actually, on paper, Pakistan has immense potential, but it's not actualized. And the more studies I did, there's this product we have called the Bismarck Brief, where we go through these case studies of various countries. The more we looked at the details, unless there's some really exceptional live players to turn around these countries, they are going to underperform their potential. Yet they have immense human capital. And this human capital for now is mostly going into the Anglosphere. And they are among the most successful individuals in the Anglosphere. I don't know if you've just noticed, politics, technology, finance. I think we're going to start seeing culture in just a few short years. We're not yet seeing it, but we will. So the Anglosphere is going to get an injection of talent from that part of the world, which is historically ironic, of course, but that's where we are, I think.
And you've spoken quite a lot today about political leadership. Obviously, we've started now talking about the more sort of economic and technological leadership. What you have not mentioned in terms of great founders or live players is our current batch of billionaires. The ones with the pointy rocket club.
The
right?
Elon Musk and Jeff
Pointing the
Bezos
sky with the pointy
world.
rocket. You got to put one up and make an Australian presenter or two laugh, and then you can join the club. How do you rate them in terms of great founder potential? And in terms of their live playerhood, as a sort of both a historically perspective person who does quite a lot of work in the future space. I have my own opinions there, but I don't want to taint you on that. But
will any of them actually help create a successful Moon or Mars colony, they definitely get the great founder title, especially if they have some idea or some notion of what this new society is going to be like. Now, whether these societies are ever going to truly outshine the society here on Earth is a different question, though the future is very long. We might be talking about consequences that play out for thousands of years. I think, the possibility exists that the current generation of entrepreneurs could also become great founders in the way that they are innovating a new social niche. They're returning to us the concept of an industrialist, a very 19th century concept, right? They are not just satisfied with making one exceptional company. They make one, and then another, and then another, and then another. And they accumulate a huge amount of capital, which means that at a certain point, they don't need to raise capital from anyone. They still can. And of course, it's one of the big ironies of history. The more money someone has, the more human beings love giving money to that person. So it's sort of like, the fundraising capabilities of a Bezos or a Musk are immense. They don't even need to spend their own money. But if they have to, they could. And that's sort of very important. It means that potentially they could fund almost state-sized projects. But can they run state-sized projects? And that's sort of, by state-sized, I don't mean, necessarily run countries, though. Maybe some
and will they be
want to
paradigm
run
shifting?
countries.
Will they be
But the equivalent,
competing old ideas?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
up in the air.
Yeah, it's like a privately funded Manhattan project, a privately managed Manhattan project, right? Or an Apollo project become a
Good idea.
possibility when we talk about this caliber of industrialist, right? So that's what I mean by projects that formerly only states could undertake. I think if they manage to actually do that, not just promise to do that, not just say that this could be done, but actually do it, they as examples will permanently shift Western and possibly all human societies to want more of such people, right? This type of industrialist. I'm not sure they're going to succeed at either that or the Moon colony or the Mars colony. But if they did, they could be great founders.
Yeah, if it's a marketing spin just to get more space tourism up there, that becomes less.
That doesn't matter. It kind of doesn't.
And more just entertainment, right? Like.
Yeah. It's like even something as brilliant as Starlink actually, I think doesn't cut it. It's like it's a brilliant piece.
Shift. Yeah.
It's a brilliant piece of infrastructure, but it's not yet a redesign of global civilization. Now, if once the Starlink system is operational, Elon declares that beyond the authority of all governments. Now, maybe that's something interesting. And he's created the Starlink Corporation that controls human communication for the next 1,000 years. Maybe that's a great founder move. Like, I don't know.
They got the potential.
I'm making
they got
fun.
The money,
but...
They got the capital, but do they have the vision to actually
execute? Yeah.
Who will actually? I think.
Do they have the vision, will, management capability? Because if they try to hire managers, it's not going to work. Yeah.
So yeah, we've got some horses in the race, is what you're saying, but we're hedging our bets for now. We'll see what happens. Anish, you've got a question again.
Yes. Again, mix of a question and something I wanted Samo's response to. I hope that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my question was that, part of the reason for this great stagnation is that the thought world which we inhabit is effectively one that was almost completely like shaped by the great founders of the Enlightenment. So far as I understand, the efficient frontier for those people was working against the excessive repressiveness of their societies among certain dimensions. And it seems that we've long exhausted that frontier. And one of the issues with that is that rights can only be at most protected once. Once, let us say, you have freed the slaves, you don't have slaves to free anymore. And so you need to sort of find and keep making up enemies against freedom, except at some point that stops. And so you just end up with, safetyism as the fallback, if you would, and harmlessness as the highest virtue. A lot of this is quite implicit. My question to you was regarding something of this kind, which is, there does seem to be certain pieces of low-hanging fruit that are invisible because of the thought world in which we live. And one of the ones that, people occasionally talk about, but is never taken seriously enough, is the concept of, let's say, the freedom of law. The same way that we have the freedom of speech or belief, right? I mean, freedom of belief is completely pointless if you are not allowed to put that belief in action at any point in the real world. It's like, anywhere where you believe something touches the real world, well, sorry, that's the domain of state law or something like that. So this overlaps with this conception of the individual as an atomic unit, also part of the Enlightenment. Again, the efficient frontier was in response to what came before, which is the individual is not important or subservient. But the healthier form of that concept is that, the freedom of law that you might have at the level of, say, a Greek city-state is in fact part of the individual freedoms that a person needs to have. Like, you need to be able to find the kind of city-state where the law is something that fits your nature for whatever that is worth, rather than the kind of global homogenization we have today. And why I consider this low-hanging fruit is that all it would take is one live player country with enough rule of law to implement something like freedom of, doesn't maybe have to be criminal law, but could be freedom of common law, for example, to allow tremendously greater cultural efflorescence and potentially even significantly brain-drained richer countries, because there's a lot of things people are willing to do in order to live the life they want. And a slight decrease in the standard of living is often the least of it. So do you have any responses to that?
If you could formulate a question, it certainly is interesting reflection, and I could
Fair.
take it in a number of
Along
ways,
the
but I
line,
want to make sure I
fair
answer the
enough.
specific
Question
question.
is more along the lines of, what is it that prevents somebody from doing this today? Because it's
Can
not
we
liable
have
to.
common law, like a more choice in terms of which laws we adopt? And I think you're talking about, like, obviously religious and cultural choices within a larger society. Could we have more freedom?
Yes, but even more, like the same way that the laws of Athens and I mean, Sparta is an extreme example, but let's say Athens and Thebes would be different.
Oh, so you're asking the question, why are countries so similar?
Yes, exactly. Like, what is going on where at least today there is a major imbalance, that even, some small country in, let's say, Southeast Asia, if they decided we want to offer greater freedom of law to enclaves, they would probably end up with a tremendous number of people coming there simply to be able to, and of course they can have rules, restrictions.
Charter cities with their own laws. Charter cities with their own laws, rather than just economic freedom, some degree of legal freedom.
I mean, you can have some basic things like no murder remains illegal, nothing too egregious, but significantly different, significantly
don't
greater
those
scope.
already exist? So if the question is that something that could actually improve the amount of great founders and live players that we get? Maybe you want to take that one, Samo.
Why does that not
that
exist?
could help.
Even though it seems to be economically a very powerful thing for any country to do if they can get away with.
Right. No, and Berman framing it in terms of the charter city is like it's a very good, clear example of what this autonomy could look like. It's a way to concretize it. I think that, first off, people aren't inspired enough by the idea of founding a city. So there's actually very few people seeking to found a city, because so few cities have been founded successfully, at least in very recent history, right? I think it can be done, but it's often the case that if something doesn't seem, for something to appear promising, you usually search the world for places where it might already be happening. So it's a little bit of like, does it start somewhere? Do we get the ball rolling? And being the first country to really open a part of your country for essentially a big social experiment like a city, it's pretty politically risky to propose. In most places around the world, these types of projects are not going to be the aspiration of the population. The aspiration of the population often is to become a developed country. Perhaps one of the answers to the question for why are all countries so similar is because we are in a way all chasing the same model of development, or maybe at most two models of development. And the very concept of developed and developing countries is the assumption of convergence. The assumption might be frustrated because, like in the phrase third and first world, the gap persists and it's stubborn, or it might be convergent, or it might be frustrated because actually different countries, if you examine their social conditions, the social technologies that exist there, the economic and geographic conditions, development would mean wildly different things. It would mean divergence, but that's not what anyone's really aiming for. And countries that, I think have independent educational institutions, often they're not very good. And if they educate their people abroad, be it in China or the United States, those people come back and re-implement what they know. So my argument would be that to see a plurality of different developments around the world, you would need a lot of different schools around the world and very different social systems for producing elites there. And this would result in a lot of life players who might have ambitions to do things like found cities, and they would not all have to be fully self-educated and self-made, because that's actually pretty rare. Like, the more preconditions to being an agentic, institution creating individual that your society can give you in the form of culture, education, and so on, the more such people there will be.
Thank you for pointing out the bottleneck institution for potential life players to target if they want this to happen. Thanks a lot.
David, you raised your hand and then you lowered it. So I want to give you a chance to open the floor for additional questions so we can get this into a bit more of a conversational style. So David, what was the question that you were going to ask?
Hi, thanks. Samo, nice to see you again.
We've
talked a bit in this chat about the social and cultural constraints on the development of live players, whether those live players are institutions or individuals. One way I think about the live player label is that it's a description of the capability to build capabilities, right? To do things that haven't been done before, I think your words. And I'd like to hear more from you about what you think the intellectual underpinnings of live player status are. How can individuals and institutions cultivate live playerhood sort of separately from the social and cultural constraints? How can you move in the direction of becoming more alive as a player?
Yeah, I think the first one is sort of accepting that a purely axiomatic approach to life doesn't work, because you're never going to start with all the right axioms. It is not the game of deriving new theorems from existing axioms. It is the game of discovering axioms you didn't even know were there, right? So a personal willingness to experience discomfort, psychological discomfort, a desire to transform yourself over and over again. But to be much more concrete here, right? Because I'm talking now about emotions, not intellectual foundations. And you asked me about intellectual foundations. I think some foundation is needed. Some theory of the human being is necessary. It doesn't have to be a complete theory, but it has to be a starting theory. Some sort of anthropological grounding. There needs to then be some theory of society, not just of humans, but of why humans have society. And possibly there has to be some theory of cosmology, almost metaphysics. Now you can pick and choose whichever tradition you want, actually. There are a number of them that are sufficient intellectual scaffolding to fulfill these. You might have someone that's a traditional Catholic live player who actually has these three quite well covered. Maybe they're an adherent of a Christian interpretation of René Girard. They believe Catholic social teaching has it right, but we have to work out the details, and their metaphysics are, the Catholic ones. But this gives them enough of a basic framework that they can receive information about the world and modify it. And then over time, they might become a Marxist Catholic or a post-structuralist Catholic, or they might decide they're not a Catholic at all, but all of their theories of epistemology somehow end up with a very Catholic Church-like hierarchy. And they, kind of think that, we can do that in academia and there should be a Pope of Science or something like this, right? I'm not picking on the Catholic example specifically. You could have a humanist version of it, like a classic Greek version of it. But I kind of think this is like a theory of the universe, a theory of society, a theory of the individual. And each of these has to be an advanced enough intellectual tradition that when you're out of the gate, when you're 15 or 20 or 25 or wherever you start the clock, you can get some wins in, because you learn way more from success than from failure. Failure is also important. Everyone says it's important to learn from failure, but really, I think successes teach you way more than failures. You can have 50 possible failures and just one way to succeed. Yeah, and if you know the one way to succeed, then fun fact, you know the 50 ways you could have failed anyway. But if you fail in one of the 50 ways, you might not know the one way to succeed. So,
if anyone has a question, please do raise your hands. We've only got around about 30 minutes left.
I do hope I answered your question, David, though.
Yeah, that's great. Listen, it's a tricky question.
Thanks.
There's lots of ways to come at it, but I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Yeah, and sorry, Bronwyn.
Can I have a quick follow-up question? Is Pope Francis in your reading a life player?
I think back when he was a bishop and a cardinal in Argentina, he was. Currently, I think there's been some changes in the Catholic Church, like say the Maltese order is now like basically directly subservient to the Vatican, which is interesting organizationally. Theologically, I think his innovations have been limited. I have to give the boring answer of I don't know. I think so much of what happens in Vatican politics is pretty opaque, no?
Sometimes there's some smoke. That's all we know.
Yeah, there's sometimes there's
smoke comes out.
Exactly.
Kian Chung, you've had your hand up, and there was also a really good question you posted on the chat, which I was going to get to if nobody asked. So please go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks, Ronnie. Yeah. Hi, Samo. Yeah. I had just this question about, I guess, underpinning of knowledge in a sense, because I think you have very deep appreciation of like history and society, and I guess how societal progress has led to where we are today. And I was wondering, like, to the extent that knowledge, to what extent this deep understanding of knowledge actually allows you to be a life player? Because I recall that you had this talk or some other platform whereby I came across your view that you do not actually see yourself as a life player as much. And I think everyone, as we go along, I think they're trying to, I guess, progress more and trying to be more of a life player. And I was wondering whether you could speak to that, and maybe to what extent maybe knowing too much about this meta game actually also sometimes constrains how we actually behave in the world. Yeah, so I'd love to hear it from you.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I had a connection issue, so you froze up for a few seconds. Just the last part of the question.
Oh yeah, as in, so I was also wondering like whether knowing too much and like maybe having too much of this idea about, okay, I need to be a live player, like knowing about this meta game, like to what extent maybe having too much knowledge about this meta game also constrains like how we behave and become a live player in a sense.
I think it's certainly possible. I think one of my favorite quotes by Friedrich Nietzsche is many a person would have been a great thinker had they not read too many books. So the idea being, no, really, that I'm pro books, but there are individuals, right, who use the consumption of other people's thinking as a replacement for their own thinking, right? If you're constantly only reflecting and never writing, never creating, that's a one-directional process, right? It's just input without output. So let me apply this here. If constantly what one is doing is thinking about these strategic frameworks, be it live versus dead player, these conceptual frameworks, but not at least applying them sometimes or acting on them, then maybe it's a form of avoidance, a psychological safety mechanism, like a warm blanket you wrap yourself in. And I think in that case, yes, knowledge can be an impediment, but I think with the right mode of action, where you balance action and thought, knowledge is never an impediment. It's just always the opportunity to do even more.
The constant accumulation of knowledge can be an excuse not to do anything.
Yes, it can be an avoidance.
It's actually, and you get praised for accumulating knowledge, right? So you get lots of little rewards, lots of treats. You get told you're doing good, right? But you know you're not. But it's still quite a comfortable form of procrastination from what you should be doing. And it's a form of procrastination that's actually a bit of an intellectual privilege, right? You have to be a certain degree of educated and a certain bent towards intellectualism, in order to get to that point. But still, it's an elite tool of procrastination, and a very, very comfortable one, because you can hide behind it for your whole life and you'll never get challenged on it. And I think that's the danger of accumulating knowledge, is that no one criticizes you for it, and no one makes you feel guilty for it. In fact, quite the opposite. You're very well praised for it. But we have questions. So Divya, am I saying your name right? Please go ahead. We haven't heard from you yet.
Yes, and you did say my name right. Apologies in advance if my question is incoherent, but one of the things that I think about a lot, and I know a lot of other people are thinking about, is basic scientific research and how the systems are broken, the institutions are broken, and there is, in fact, no pathway for a live player at this point in time make an impact or to be a live player. And as I think about it, I'm like, okay, well, maybe you need a research institution, but maybe the college is broken, maybe the high school is broken. So it seems like the entire life path now, there's only a pathway for the people following that script, as you mentioned. So if you were going to create an institution to enable live players, in which area would you think you would have, like, which area would be the most useful? Which one's the most dysfunctional? Would it be in science? Would it be in culture, politics, economics? If you could just pick one, which one would you pick? Leaving aside what it would look like.
Do. Oh, I'm sorry. There was you froze. So if I spoke over you, I apologize.
That's all right. Yeah. You froze too.
Cool. Yeah, which area would I pick? Well, it's almost a process of elimination. I think science is not a bad place. I think we have I think we lack a good socioeconomic niche in our society for the generalist thinker, someone that would synthesize, say, science, politics, economics, and like make connections between those areas productively. So the generalist, the Renaissance man ideal, we don't have a good niche for people like that. We could do more to develop that. I also think that in science, sort of, academia has firmly conflated the scholar and the scientists really, really profoundly, where a lot of what it does is document insights. It does not strive to generate insights, right? What you're supposed to do is publish a paper. It doesn't really matter if the paper says something that's truly a significant contribution or not. And we could go into sort of some of the micro dysfunctionalities of academia, but I'm just going to highlight one. Tenure used to be this place that allowed a thinker to say something that their peers disagreed with, because occasionally they would be right, and whatever the previous consensus was proposing was not correct, was incomplete, or was something to be overturned. Today, the process of getting tenure is a process where at every stage of selection, you are selected to be someone to not exercise the privilege of tenure. You are selected to be as agreeable as possible, as sort of like not rocking the boat for what, 40 years, 30 years, 20 years of your life? 20 is optimistic already, right? Like we have a position that exists with a clear logic to it, and we don't let anyone near it who could possibly make use of the logic. That's why all the eccentric professors are people in their 80s or 70s, not people in their 50s. So science, right? How do we credential the crackpots who are right? I think we need a mechanism to credential the crackpots who turn out to have been right. The internet produces a lot of interesting autodidacts, and I think no one's systematically harnessed them yet and given them PhDs and put them in a nice school. And by school, I mean just a place that gives them like recognition for what they already are and some nice photo photo shoots and maybe a bureaucratic piece of paper, but actually just lets them write a book or something. Like, I think that institution would be amazing.
Like
But
a
it would have
Bell
to pick the right
Labs.
crackpots,
Right.
the
Bell
geniuses.
Labs, yeah. What do we have as equivalent now?
Yeah,
We don't really.
that's what we need.
Absolutely. Kian-Shang, do you have another question there? Your hand's up. What else would you like to have clarified?
Oh no, I think I just didn't put my hand down. But actually, I was just wondering, as a follow-up to, I guess, to my earlier question, are there like specific domains where you don't necessarily need knowledge, in a sense, to be a live player? Because maybe what comes to my mind is, let's say, people like Kanye West. I think we should probably term as a live player. Maybe, okay, maybe I don't know, I guess, his background enough, but from my understanding as, like, let's say, from a cultural field, like, it seems like there's more space to actually break away from the confines of knowledge to actually be a live player in that field, because you are not actually, you don't have to replicate whoever is actually ahead of you. You just, I guess, in a way, you're almost like a jazz player. You can just, I guess, what do you call it? You can just improv, you know.
I'm sorry again. I don't know what the connection trouble is, but could you repeat the question? I apologize.
Hey, no worries.
I lost some audio.
Yeah, just one. I think maybe it's also my internet. I was just wondering, like, as a follow-up to my earlier question, like whether there are certain fields whereby, in a sense, knowledge actually constrains you. So in a sense, like, let's say people like, say, Kanye West, which I think you previously mentioned as a live player before. From, let's say, my external kind of position, like, it almost feels like they have, I guess, more of a latitude to play and as well as improv, because I think building on to what Anesh was talking about just now, whereby there are certain models, let's say, in terms of, let's say, societal progress, whereby let's say a CEO of organization might want to have certain kind of like return on equity, as in return on capital and stuff. So there's certain kind of predefined kind of like progress that success metrics, which usual kind of like organization leaders will actually go
There's
down.
like a track that you're supposed to follow, right? There's like a certain set of positions you're supposed to have by a certain year of your career. And if you're not, then you're clearly not as good as the people who followed the track really well. Yeah, I really think that those tracks discourage exploration, and exploration is just very, very much the strength of live players. So if you have a system that only rewards tracked positions, you will have a system where you're trying to, I don't know why, but you are trying to advantage very competent dead players rather than live players, rather than people who create new tracks.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's similar to, I think Peter Thiel had this phrase whereby he said that competition is for losers, in a sense.
Yeah, actually, but I gotta go take that open space. Anna.
Yeah, kind of reaction to what you said, Kan-Chong, and the kind of this topic. I am reminded of one of Eliezer Yudkowsky's brilliant essays in the Harry Potter book, where he basically argues that you know, very smart people are a little bit more difficult to catch because you argue differently. You have like a very intimidating vocabulary, and you can be full of shit, excuse my French, and it will sound great. And you will actually have people who are either just not buying into big words or who are actually smarter than you to catch you. And I think this in a way prohibits innovation, because if you have, you know, if you speak more simply, then if you're wrong, you're more quickly found out. And that's good. Like in science, you should be found out. You should not be hiding behind titles and behind, you know, incomprehensible text. You know, you should be like, no, you're wrong, stop going in the direction, and then you iterate. This is the whole Feynman spiel as well, like talk simply, because otherwise I'm not going to believe that you know what you're talking about. And to me, this is a really interesting thing, like if people who read too many books, people who are too smart, will not just become less innovative because they are more self-conscious, but because they don't get clean feedback. Because so few people understand what they're talking about, and those few people are very busy, right? And they have a lot of things to peer review. So that would be an interesting thing to see how being too smart actually inhibits the seniors from forming. I think even Google's Aristotle project found that, individual IQ levels in a team don't make a team effective. Like psychological safety, for instance, is much more important, that you can try and fail in a group. But in order to fail, you have to have people who tell you that this is wrong. I don't know if you've been in situations like, of course, like we host so many conversations, like sometimes there's somebody who just sounds so smart that nobody will go. It's like
because no one really understands what they're saying, because they're not using simple, well-defined language. No, stylistically, it's an extremely important point. It's one of the ways in which blogging culture actually has made a great contribution to our society. Blogs in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, which by the way is also where Yudkowsky learned to write and where other writers have learned to write. Of course, drawing deeper inspiration on things like George Orwell's essay on the English language and so on. These are excellent sources. They have corrected for a tendency in academic and expert speech to basically use terms as obfuscation. Politics, of course, also specializes in that, though depending on the country, you might hide your wording behind technocratic phrasings, which I think they do in Germany, or behind like meaningless self-contradictory folksisms as they do in the United States, right? So I really think that for a brief time, the blogosphere trained up a whole new generation of writers that re-explained the world to us. And it's not a coincidence that every year, I just compare the style of the New York Times and a blog in 2005 and compare it today. Every year, the New York Times is becoming closer and closer to the style of blog writing. It's not blog writing that sounds more like the New York Times. The New York Times sounds more like a blogger. And that's actually good. Maybe you should do that faster. Right? That would be my controversial thesis on simplicity, that the bloggers did change how we all write in the English language for the better.
Cutting through all the frills and making it more and more accessible, more democratized. They're getting those ideas out. But at the same time, we've also got more content you got to cut through, right? So there's a quality issue that comes through there. Who's got the time to curate? And isn't that a lot of that just overwhelming content slowing us down? Like just the overwhelming abundance of everything.
Certainly
like
on social media.
Like right at the beginning, we said like scarcity is like something we chase as value, but we don't have scarcity of much. Is that perhaps what's lacking? That we don't have enough scarcity really in any direction, and that perhaps the next couple of years might provide us with some?
Well, I think there are different mechanisms of content curation and moderation. I think we've not yet discovered how to make this truly scale. I am deeply respectful of whoever has figured out, well, let's put it this way, the YouTube algorithms governing where you discover any sort of practical craft. I'm not going to talk about social commentary, but any practical craft. Anything I want to learn, I can enter into the search bar on YouTube and I will find it. Like, is it cooking? Is it casting iron? Is it casting, a cast iron pan to then cook with it? Like, I will find the right sequence of videos with people recorded taking all of those steps. And the search engine somehow just works. Google used to be like that for the internet. It seemed for a while search engines would full stop solve this problem, but kind of a red queen race kicked in. And I don't know, this might just be me, but I think many people have written and complained about this. Google and other search engines are just vastly less useful than they were 10 or 15 years ago. It might be because there's more content, but I actually think it's because everyone realized that to get to people's attention, they have to trick the search engine. So the search engine versus the people, the sites who are being, found.
Us. Yeah, it changed how we
change our behavior. Exactly. And I don't know why on YouTube this has not happened. Maybe it's happened in politics and social commentary, But like I said, I can find any sort of practical craft I want there, and I can just get a thorough education in it. And I think people don't realize how amazing and marvelous that is, how much economic value that adds to society that's never captured in GDP numbers. Actually, it might shrink GDP. If YouTube teaches me how to fix my 10-year-old car, then I didn't go to the car shop, did I? Nor did I buy a new car. So in real terms, material wealth, in GDP terms, lower GDP, and certainly not necessarily that much profit for Google, or sorry, Alphabet that owns and runs YouTube, right? So it's for now like this nice positive externality we can enjoy. I think there's something to be said about reputation on the nice and selected areas of Twitter. I think there's some sort of superstar writers that have really ascended through Twitter who are actually quite good, and the audience they have are quite good. So when these writers recommend other writers, other material, books, intellectual stuff, their recommendations are often quite good. So there's something like an informal reputation system where you're like, oh, which thought leader are you following? Oh, did you see? And you know, let's say Nassim Taleb is like now less cool to most people than he was 8 years ago, but people will say things like, oh, did you see what Nassim Taleb recommended, or Jordan Peterson recommended, and Eliezer Yudkowsky recommended? That those sorts of recommendations have wide reach. So we have then search engines, personal recommendations, in theory, news aggregator sites, but I feel Hacker News works less well than it used to. Still has some interesting stuff there. So various voting systems like Reddit's, those, let's say they're okay. I'm less impressed by them than by search engines and like individuals who have very high reputation and very good taste and an interest in supporting the work of others, but they do complete sort of the list of how we've been trying to tame this flood of information.
Yeah, that's a good point to start there. It's like the people versus the tools that people have made, right? Sometimes our
Right.
tools actually slow us down rather than speed us up. And because you can see a lot of those examples in a lot of places. I mean, traffic being the obvious example, right? I mean, in many countries, it literally has slowed us down. And we feel like we're progressing, we're not going very far. Sometimes the Red Queen treadmill breaks down a little bit. But I'm conscious of the time of yours and of our guests tonight. If there's one more question, we can probably take it now. If anyone's got anything that they did not get asked, and Anna's got her hand up, so she's going to take that slot unless someone else.
I was clapping. I'm clapping for the host.
You're clapping now.
This is not my hand up. I have no question. Don't give me
no
the
questions. Amazing. But if you do have a question, we've got time for one more. So one more person can get there.
Maybe somebody who hasn't gone yet.
I know I can see all you down there that don't have your cameras on.
Maria.
Thomas, thank you. We have a contender. Please go ahead.
Hey all. This has been an exciting talk. I've been honestly just like bouncing around about my day as I've been listening in, but this has been fantastic, and thank you for hosting. My question is like very much around like topologies, like network thesis. And one thing that's interesting as it pertains to like chart cities and like that, becoming much more difficult to start, especially I guess like given the and how like nation they're not well incentivized to. I'm wondering, like, what do you think, if you thought about it at all, Samo, about like how network states could actually enter into the game and cause disruption or competition between like existing play out to be, or in terms of like how that could be as like a novel vector for being a live player?
Network states and live playerhood, how are they interlinked?
In 1 minute.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
1 minute.
1 minute. Network states, ironically, have a problem of self-governance where classical territorial states make it abundantly clear how you include or exclude something. It's a matter of territory. For network states, the regulation of the network is a somewhat unsolved problem. However, you know, it would be a very live player move to sort of bring about the first network state. I think that would be remarkable and interesting. And I found Balaji's book very interesting and worth reading.
Thank you. And of course, since you've been so generous with your time here this evening or today, depending on where we are in the world, do you have any closing thoughts for us, Samo, before we wrap this up and put this onto the internet for future generations and perhaps to inspire some future live players to get playing?
Well, I would encourage everyone who's listening to try the best that you can in your life to combine thought and action. I feel today we have one without the other. And really, like, if we can bridge that gap, all our problems are solvable. Pragmatic optimism. That's what we need more of. So get some more live players in the game. It's a very uncompetitive landscape out there. Lots of opportunities to kick that ball. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and most especially to Samo and to Anna, of course, who put this all together. Thanks all. Cheers. Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone, for good questions.